Hello and good afternoon, fellow Gero students. My name is Carrie Redman, and this presentation will focus on the article, The Genetics of Suicide, an overview. But first, I would like to provide a brief introduction of myself. I reside in the small town of Hudsonville, a suburb of Grand Rapids in western Michigan, which is home to our 38th President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. The city of Hudsonville, which is famously known for its ice cream, and for all you tryhards out there like me, Taylor Lautner, and is approximately 20 miles from the beautiful shores of Lake Michigan. I completed my bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in sociology at Ashford University in 2012, and this is my third class here at USC. I just recently started my own business called Lean On Me Compassionate Care, specializing in the care and safety of the elderly who suffer from chronic conditions. I work with clients, their families, and physicians to find the most effective and safe way to manage ADLs based on their disabilities. The reason why I started this business was not only my knack for caring for others, but my first two clients happened to be my very own parents. My mother, who has multiple sclerosis, and my father, who has Parkinson's disease. The Genetics of Suicide article provides a quantitative research study from the mid-1960s through mid-2003 that was conducted linking a controlled group with a non-controlled group in order to define whether genetic factors or shared environmental experiences are linked to increased risk of suicidal behavior. Potential risk factors for suicide include aggression, impulsivity, anxiety, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, personality disorders such as antisocial personality disorder, and substance use and abuse. In persons with such conditions, the risk of suicide is 10 to 20 times more likely than the general population. This study concentrated on families, twin studies of identical and fraternal twin pairs, adoptions, and molecular genetic studies. The study did provide strong support that there was an increased risk for suicide among families, especially among close relatives who were already suicidal or that had mental disorders in comparison to families who didn't show any of these symptoms, but failed to really distinguish genetic risk factors from environmental factors. The twin study was limited and inconsistent in defining any suicide behaviors with attempts versus completed suicides, while suggesting that suicidal behavior may be vastly different from psychological disorders or other risk factors. The adoption study, because it's difficult to obtain adoption records, the information that was gathered from one database of public health records failed to really separate nature versus nurture risk for suicidal behavior. The molecular genetics study, which primarily focused on proteins involved in the actions of serotonin, remains an evolving research topic and for now is tentative and inconclusive. After more careful research on alternate articles pertaining to genetic traits linked to suicide, I found some interesting journal articles pertaining to the subject. Martin A. Coley, PhD of the John P. Hussman Institute for Human Genomics, and his colleagues studied genetic variants among 394 patients who suffered from depression, 113 who had attempted suicide, and 366 who were healthy control participants. They investigated single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, which are variants in a single base pair along a strand of DNA in the neurotrophic system. This is the system that is responsible for producing proteins involved in nerve cell growth. What did they find? 5 SNPs were clearly more common among those with a history of suicide attempts, with a 4.5-fold higher risk than the healthy control participants. This research supports the hypotheses that dysfunctional neurotrophic signaling in nerve cell growth could very well be responsible for suicidal behavior. In the American Journal of Medical Genetics, David Backish, a psychiatrist at the Royal Ottawa Hospital, along with other researchers at the hospital's Institute of Mental Health Research, studied patients who continually had repeated thoughts of killing themselves and who had family histories of suicide. The goal for Bakish, who believed that suicide is either a cry for help or that some people have difficulty controlling their suicidal fantasies, wanted to dig deeper into the human brain, so he turned to genetic testing. What would follow was a 10-year study which gave Bakish and his colleagues the ability to identify those at risk. What they discovered was a genetic variation that affects the brain chemistry with the mutation in the gene encoding the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, making some more than twice as likely to attempt suicide as those who suffered from depression, although they didn't carry the mutation. Because serotonin is a neurotransmitter that carries messages between brain cells and is involved in the regulation of emotions, along with other functions, wouldn't it make sense that the genes that regulate the serotonin system could possibly be responsible for suicide? Up until the 1980s, most professionals in the field of psychiatry and psychology thought that people who committed suicide were depressed. But this view changed dramatically when research began to focus on autopsies of the brains of people who had committed suicide. What the autopsies revealed was structural changes in the prefrontal cortex, which controls high-level decision-making and altered levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin. More importantly, what they found was that these characteristics in the brain appeared regardless of whether they suffered from depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or no apparent disorders at all. Epidemiological studies support the fact that mental illness and self-destructiveness run in families. The two countries with the highest rates of suicide are Hungary and Finland, where there are 40 suicides for every 100,000 people. Researchers have pinpointed that because the Finno-Ugric people lived for thousands of years in the Ural Mountains of what is now Russia before migrating to Finland and Hungary. So even though these countries are over 100 miles apart, the people not only share the same language, but also the same genes. Another study, published by the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1985, researched the rate of suicide among the Amish population in southern Pennsylvania. Through genealogical and medical records for that population, 4 particular families accounted for 73% of all suicides, but represented only 16% of the total Amish population in that area. In her book, Night Falls Fast, clinical psychologist Kay Redfield Jamison with Johns Hopkins University knows suicide firsthand. After suffering with manic depression for most of her life, she attempted suicide at the age of 28. Jamison states, genes are, of course, only part of the tangle of suicide, but their collision with psychological and environmental elements can prove to be the difference between life and death. For those interested in a good read on mental illness and suicide, may I suggest Danielle Steele's book, His Bright Light, The Story of Nick Traina. Nick was her son whose mental illness spiraled out of control until he took his own life at the age of 19. This book captured the very essence of what kind of world manic depressives live in, and of course, Danielle Steele's writing captures every moment of confusion, desperation, frustration, and hope to save the life of her son during the short years she cherished with him. Mental health professionals are starting to take notice that classifying suicidal tendencies as a disease should be taken seriously. Those involved in the Edition 5 of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders have now proposed to have suicidal behavior disorder classified as a distinct mental disorder. This diagnosis could push researchers to further examine the neurological, genetic, and environmental factors responsible for suicidal thoughts and tendencies. This could ultimately help better distinguish and diagnose whether someone is at a suicide risk, prompting mental health professionals to recognize and properly treat the disorder. As you have seen, researchers are working diligently in attempting to understand the underlying causes of suicidal tendencies, who is more prone to it, and why certain people make the decision to take their own life. The more they are better able to unfold the mystery behind the neurological, genetic, and even environmental factors that put those at risk for suicidal behavior, the better they will be able to treat and properly diagnose the behavior associated with it. The Genetics of Suicide article assigned failed to really distinguish whether some people are more prone to suicide based on either environmental or genetic factors. The family, twin, adoption, and molecular genetic studies all had limitations to the research study. Adoption studies tend to be less common, even though the study can view the environmental factors of those who were adopted early in life. It's difficult and sometimes impossible to really be able to track their genetic roots, since there are numerous closed adoptions where biological roots cannot be obtained. Although the research as a whole looked promising, I believe the results of this study are inconclusive. Because it's challenging to define the heritability of the risk associated with suicide, especially any disorders that are strongly similar, such as substance abuse and aggression, it is of great importance that researchers continue to be persistent in their efforts to not only understand such a disorder, but more importantly, unlock the mystery behind why and what factors are responsible for something to go amiss in the brain, making a person choose to end their own life.